Good evening here, good morning there in New York, and wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining this important discussion. Distinguished representatives of member states, the esteemed panelists joining us here today, the vibrant, engaged civil society representatives also with us. Most importantly, organizations of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities themselves who have joined us from around the world. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be part of this on behalf of the UN in India and as the representative of the Secretary General here in India as well. So I would like to start by just joining my colleagues and who have helped to organize this discussion, Parul Agarwala from UN Habitat, India, in McKinnon from Global Disability Innovation Hub as well, and the other panel members who will be bringing really, I think, leading us towards some really vibrant and engaging discussions. This side event, Inclusive Urban Development, Accessibility as an Enabler for Reaching Underrepresented Groups of Persons with Disabilities, is being organized as part of the 16th session of the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I think this is really truly a great opportunity, and we hope that we can all use this opportunity to drive forward the overarching theme of harmonizing national policies and strategies with the CRPD, with the convention, really to look at concrete challenges, achievements, best practices. So, while we discuss the progress in ensuring the rights of persons with disabilities, and there's so much good news to celebrate, and of course, there's so many challenges, so much more work that needs to be done as well. We felt that it's very important to examine the critical role of accessible urban development in fostering true inclusivity. As we know, the world continues to urbanize at quite a rapid rate. And, speaking from the perspective here in India, this is certainly true. Two mega trends are making the need for inclusive cities increasingly urgent. And I've actually just penned an op-ed in the Indian Express newspaper just yesterday, in fact, together with the National Institute of Urban Affairs, focusing on this point. And the first being that India is urbanizing incredibly rapidly and is projected to add 4 new mega cities by 2030. So for lack of a better analogy, think of 4 new Chicagos, something like that, by the end of the decade. So it's quite dramatic. And the country's urban population is estimated to cross over, almost nearly 700 million people. Now, according to the last census, the number of persons with disabilities already living in the urban environment, something like 1/3 of persons with disabilities, so roughly 8 million people already living in cities, and that number is just set to increase quite rapidly. Secondly, the total number of persons with formally recognized disabilities as a share of the overall population is expected to increase as we move forward due to a number of different aspects, increasing risks in the environment, climate risks, demographic changes, and also broader definitions of disabilities, recognized disabilities in line with global norms and standards. So, we also look at here in India a number of emerging solutions. One powerful solution that government and business and civil society are coming together around increasingly is information communication technologies and innovative technologies. India is a true leader in this space, and these are vitally important, increasingly important in terms of providing an inclusive urban transformation. India is bringing to bear a world-class digital governance system, providing access to public services digitally, and increasingly making these services accessible for persons with disability. This is the spirit right now being felt very much within India's G20 presidency, trying to share this message, especially around digital public infrastructure through the G20 presidency, that platform as well. So I think now, of course, everywhere in every country, urban environments are, vibrant hubs of social, economic, cultural activity, you name it. So it's essential that, of course, from the beginning, we design and we plan our built environments in a way that is inclusive and leaves no one behind. And the United Nations, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, provides that comprehensive framework to help us, guide us in safeguarding the rights and promoting full and equal participation of persons with disabilities in all aspects of life. And I think that, now, of course, despite the significant progress that has been made in advancing rights of persons with disabilities and underrepresented groups, continue to face very significant, numerous overlapping barriers, particularly in the urban environment, especially affecting people who may face multiple overlapping disabilities, or women and girls with disabilities, persons with intellectual disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, and others who are marginalized and face sort of overlapping, intersecting forms of discrimination. So I think the discussion today, we really hope that we can help together collectively shed the light on practical achievements, best practices. How can we help to harmonize national policies and strategies? How can we bring together, again, government, business, civil society, and most of all, organizations of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities themselves, not without us, not for us, without us. Again, that mantra is so vitally important. And we have to be looking across really the complexity of the urban environment, inclusive infrastructure, inclusive transportation systems, data and governance, housing, public spaces, ICT, the role of community engagement and empowerment, because nothing is happening sort of in a vacuum. And again, just to say that we look forward to this being a truly engaging discussion. Take advantage, please, the audience, speaking to everybody here on the call, take advantage of the various means available to you to let us hear your voice, so that we can take it forward into the broader Conference of Parties discussion and process. And I think that you'll see that there's really, this is not just talking the talk, but we can walk the walk as well. And this is vitally an important part of that process. This is an opportunity for community voice to be heard. Thank you very much. With that, I'll conclude. And just to say, as we say here in Delhi, Bahat Dhanyavad.
Thank you so much for setting the stage. And this is such a great perspective to have to start the event today. And really, we are so happy that you could join us and could give us some of your time. With that, I think we would like to move forward with the panel discussion, and actually the much awaited panel discussion. We have a great set of panelists who have joined us at the event today. So I would like to hand over to Mr. Ian McKinnon, who is the Director of Inclusive Design at the Global Disability Innovation Hub. So I hand over to you, Ian, for the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Adishree, and thank you so much, Mr. Sharp, for those fantastic introductory opening remarks. I think it sets the scene very well. My name is Ian McKinnon. I am one of the co-founders and directors of the Global Disability Innovation Hub, or GDI Hub. I lead our work on inclusive design, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel discussion. I think, as Mr. Sharp said, I'm sure we'll have vibrant discussions and can shed light on some of the kind of key issues, but also opportunities and hopefully some good practice examples to share as well. In my kind of opening remarks as moderator, I was posed the question, what are cities doing to advance inclusion and accessibility, and what are the existing gaps in the infrastructure of services and facilities in cities that impede access for all? So just by way of, I guess, giving a little bit of opening context from me, I really believe the simple fact is that cities need to and can do more. Our research, GDI Hub's research on the UK aid-funded 80-20-30 programme has shown us that while there are good intentions and in places very good policies and even really good technical standards in place, often translating these into real-life, tangible solutions that make an actual difference to people's lives is hard and often therefore lacking. So there are a number of key reasons for this, which our research findings will spell out when it completes towards the end of this year. But I thought I would start just by providing a couple of quick examples to demonstrate what I mean by that. So in Varanasi in India, which was one of our 6 case study cities on the 80-20-30 research, there's a great deal of good work taking place, particularly as part of India's smart city mission. It's fast becoming a real hub for innovation and has also shown great resilience and adaptability, particularly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, many disabled residents still found Varanasi a challenging city to call home, due to a lack of accessible public transport options, a lack of access to culture and heritage sites, and also a lack of access to education and employment opportunities. So I think Varanasi is a good example of a city with really good intentions, but a challenging reality. It's a historic and culturally significant city that needs innovative solutions to create a more inclusive place for persons with disabilities to live, to work, and of course, to visit. Another case study from our 80-20-30 research is the city of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And an example there is where there's a public bus service that does provide an accessible vehicle option. However, most of the fleet is inaccessible, meaning that for many persons with disabilities, it's a massively reduced and so ineffective service. Also, the public transport services don't extend into the informal settlements that surround the city, which also happen to be where the majority of persons with disabilities live in Ulaanbaatar. So again, this means that while intentions are good, the lived reality for most is not. So we need to do more and we need to do better. And today we're going to hear from a fantastic panel of experts who will share their thoughts on some of the key issues and solutions that can help create more inclusive urban developments and make a positive difference to the lives of persons with disabilities around the world. Now, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn, and then we hope at the end we will have time for a Q&A. So as audience members, if you are able to type your questions into either the Q&A box or the chat, that would be fantastic. We'll try and pick some of them up at the end. Also, I've been asked if I can pause here, and we have some poll questions that we're going to do throughout the session. So the first poll question should be there. I'll pause for a moment, and if you could all take a moment just to answer that poll question, that would be great. That question is, which stakeholder group do you represent? So a nice easy one to get us started. Okay, so a good mix, which is actually perfect. That's really what we were aiming for with this session, so that's good. We've got 29% government and policy sector stakeholder groups, 29% civil society or OPD, 4% private sector, so slightly smaller from the private sector, 17% research/academia, and 21% have put other. So thank you, that's fantastic. So I'll move on to our first panelist then, who's Mr. Raj Sherubal, who is the Chief Development Goals Specialist at the SDG Coordination Centre at the Government of Tamil Nadu in India, in collaboration with UNDP. Previously, CEO of the Chennai Smart City Limited, and is interested in improving urban governance, urban quality of life, and has worked on various projects on sustainable transportation, urban planning, multimodal public transportation, sustainable financing of urban infrastructure, and regional planning. And so the question to put to Mr. Sherubal here is, how can governments, the civil sector, international development organizations, and the private sector work together to improve the inclusion and accessibility in infrastructure, facilities, and services, breaking down those silos and ensuring a cross-cutting approach to disability inclusive urban development? Raj, over to you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for this wonderful opportunity. I hope you can hear me well. Since I have, I think, 5 minutes, I'll quickly go on. First, if you had told me a lot of this discussion will happen 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, I would have not believed you. Having been part of Smart City and a lot of initiative at the state level and the central level and so on, there's been quite a bit of initiatives which tries to translate theory into practice. So, for example, in most of the smart cities, there's been a pedestrian plaza or better footpath or something that says, can we build infrastructure that is inclusive? So, whether you, whatever the inclusive, whatever the disability may be, yeah, can we be inclusive? This is very important because unlike in other countries, Indian cities, and I'm sure there are other countries where we have a similar problem, the capacity of cities and towns to actually do good infrastructure, well thought through, and so on, doesn't exist. So what you will see is bits and pieces of some interesting stuff, but the rest of the city, 99% of the city will be inaccessible, like randomly done bits and pieces of projects. So at least there is a start to the whole point. So from a public infrastructure point of view, I think it is time that not only government, but also civil society has been working a lot, obviously, on it, where we start putting certain enforcements in place. So, for example, you can't build a house without certain things. You can't build a house and say, fancy house and say, I'm not going to give you water, or I'm not going to give you electricity, or, just no elevator and so on and so forth. We don't have that kind of a stricter standard for basic infrastructure, whether it's footpath, intermodal integration, how do you climb into a bus, what kind of a bus fleet should you have. These kinds of things are still getting done in bits and pieces. So I think it's time that from the union government level, state government level, and the city government level, you have standards for this. And we don't have to spend endless years creating standards. There are enough standards floating around. Various organizations and like government bodies have created standards. So I think it's time for us to say that any new infrastructure to begin with will comply with these standards. It'll be not only designed by qualified architects and so on, but it will also be vetted by stakeholders, vetted by experts, so that each element is inclusive. So a simple, quick example will be, earlier I used to say, look, I'm not a civil engineer. I don't know how to build a footpath, but I know that if I'm in a wheelchair or if I'm pushing a wheelchair, I should be able to go end to end. There should be some very simple standards so that citizens can start monitoring and giving feedback and so on. But enforcement is missing. Even though we talk about in theory, in seminars, we talk about standards, the enforcement of those standards are missing. When it comes to private sector, I don't know how much we can do. That is, I know that the American Disabilities Act in the early 90s, I think, did put in laws that said, look, you need to retrofit your buildings. New buildings have to comply with these things. It will be good for some of the NGOs and others to, in the Indian context, come back and help government understand, okay, what if India were to come up with a law that says, look, maybe it's already there, but how do you strengthen it? How do you ensure that every building, starting with government buildings, are accessible, wheelchair accessible, and accessible in other ways? What is how practical is it? Where are we missing? What are the gaps? I think it is time to get into the action mode because there's a lot of standards, a lot of discussion has happened. So I think we need to get to that point. The third and final point I'll make is that this is my personal opinion. Somehow, the idea that we'll all get old is, we all agree, everybody agrees, nobody's debating that. So it's automatically in our mind that we need to start saving for the future, etc., etc. But when it comes to inclusive infrastructure, there is still that attitude that we are doing charity for somebody else. Let's do some nice things for the disabled community. Let's buy a few buses that is inclusive, or let's little bit of infrastructure here. Let's think about what will happen to when a person comes in a wheelchair and so on. I think there needs to be a sustained campaign which changes everybody's mind that any day, any one of us can be disabled, right? It can happen today, or all of us are going to get old. There's no debate about it. All of us are going to be disabled in various ways and means. So I think that while standards and paperwork and government orders are there, the attitude that it is not a charity we are doing for somebody else. It is not like every 100 buses there should be 2 buses which are wheelchair friendly or something like that. My attitude is that every bus could be AC, every bus could be disabled friendly. You don't have to have just selectively 2-3 buses in a fleet that is catering to certain groups and so on and so forth. So I think all of us, no matter which organization we represent, I think it is time to do various kinds of campaigns, behavioral economics, so that policymakers, engineers in the city, etc., don't look at all this like doing favor to somebody, rather than it should be built in that I'm even out of self-interest, I'm doing it for my own future. That when we save money in the bank, we have that attitude, right? I'm doing it for myself and my family for the future. But I think when it comes to public infrastructure and private infrastructure, we need to think charitably and from a self-interest point of view. So only then everybody will start thinking every inch of the infrastructure from an inclusive point of view. I'll stop here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Sherabal, for that start as a first panel speaker. I've taken some notes. I mean, some really key statements there about enforcement being missing, action being needed, and the need to change attitudes. But that's a great start. Thank you so much. And we'll hopefully have time to take some questions from the audience at the end as well. I think we'll move straight on then to our second panelist, and I think we'll maybe do another pause for a poll afterwards. So our second panelist is Ms. Ramala Naik Singru, who is a Principal Urban Development Specialist for the Central and West Asia Department at the Asian Development Bank. With over 24 years of international experience as an urban and regional planner, urban designer and architect, Ramala is a thought leader and strategic planner for innovative solutions for livable cities, green cities, and inclusive cities. So the question that we're going to pose to Ramala is, what are the bottlenecks in financing inclusive and accessible infrastructure and services in cities? For instance, are funds allocated to retrofit and add new accessible infrastructure? And if not, then what is the funding gap? So Ramala, hope where you are is good, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. And yes, I am in Tbilisi. Unfortunately, we are experiencing some issues with the internet. But thank you for the question and for inviting me to this very interesting and excellent panel. Financing inclusive and accessible infrastructure and services is critical to the development of livable cities. And it actually brings socioeconomic benefits that are far beyond the incremental costs associated with it. So one would wonder, why is all infrastructure not accessible? Admittedly, the financing gap is large for even basic infrastructure. So for example, if we take India needs to invest more than 840 billion over the next 15 years for urban infrastructure to effectively meet the needs of the population. So demands are high. And if you add other issues such as climate change financing to it, then it becomes incremental. And we do need to think about how do we finance this gap. But I believe that it is not very difficult to mobilize financing for accessibility inclusion. What is really limiting, and I also agree with my previous colleague on the panel, that it is the lack of awareness with regard to what needs to be done in terms of inclusive and accessible infrastructure and services that is inhibiting. In several countries, I work in Central and West Asia, and here I think it was much more trying to bring awareness to the government about what could be done. And that is where really the critical aspect lies, about building capacity, building knowledge, and also to showcase and convince that there is a very high level of payback in terms of economic benefits. But in financial terms, we do have to think about innovative ways that we can finance this, because admittedly, if we cannot leave a lot of the infrastructure here, whether you talk about housing infrastructure or public space management or public transport, it does need a lot of upstream investment from the public sector. So we work a lot with the public sector, but also through our private sector arm, and we try to bring together innovative solutions. If I take the example of Georgia, I just wanted to highlight that when in 2017 we started working on discussing disability inclusion and developing some guidelines and standards for adapting the built environment for the persons with disabilities, for the older persons, even for women with small children. We started from kind of, the economic benefits, because the government was very keen on tourism. And we said, accessible tourism is going to really benefit the country. So we started small, but then we expanded it to ensure that it actually built standards, which are the inclusive cities guidelines, and you helped us also with it. These were ensuring that not just accessible tourism, but also all of the public spaces, all of the urban transport, and all of the infrastructure that we invest in under livable cities will be accessible. We are now working with the Tbilisi City Hall to ensure accessibility for the Tbilisi Metro. And that is a huge investment. It's more than $26 million, and the government is very keen to move forward with it. And this actually showcases that it is not that governments do not want to invest. It is not that there is a reluctance in investing or there is high cost associated with accessibility, but it is much more about ensuring that there are champions and there is a know-how of what needs to be done. Wherever ADB has worked with our developing member countries, whether in People's Republic of China or Georgia, Uzbekistan, we've seen that there is an interest to actually move forward and to bring in universal design principles. And I think that is where we should continue working closely. Another area which I want to touch on is disability inclusion in climate financing. Increasingly, if you see, a lot of persons with disabilities do have a disadvantage. They do not have access to emergency response services. This is where I think we have to go that extra mile to make sure that we can actually meet the needs and bring in terms of even disaster risk management and climate resilience for communities who are marginalized. I'll stop there and thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ramala. And internet connection certainly for me was perfect. So we timed it well. Thank you so much. So again, some really great points there about the fact that the governments do want to invest, and it's about having those champions in place and having know-how, local know-how. I think really important points. I will pause. I've been asked to pause here again. So we're going to go to the polls once more, and our second poll question should be available to you. So if I can ask you all to please open the poll and answer those questions for me, that would be great. The question is, it is estimated that by 2050, 66% of the world's population, which is 6.3 billion people, will be living in cities. What is the estimated number of persons with disabilities that will be living in cities by 2050? So have a go at that on the poll. The options are 198 million, 2.1 billion, 895 million, or not sure. There we go. Okay, thank you very much for taking part in that. And so I think most of you got this correct, because I think that is the correct answer. I should know this maybe. But so 43% going with 2.1 billion, which is out in front. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is the correct answer. So well done. That's great. Okay, I think what we'll do is to remind you all again, just to pop any questions you'd like to put to our panel in the Q&A box for us, and we'll do our best to pick those up with our panelists at the end. But otherwise, I'm going to move on to our third panelist and introduce. So Ms. Vanesha Manuturi is the Communications and Advocacy Manager at Kota Kita in Indonesia. Vanesha is deeply passionate about the power of stories in driving social movements. She leads initiatives that foster an inclusive and open space for critical urban discourses and ultimately advance meaningful citizen participation in urban development. So with that in mind, our question to Vanessa is, what are a few good practices for achieving inclusive services and facilities in cities, such as in data management, education, mobility, and in the planning of public spaces? So Vanessa, I hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ian. And I'd like to say a quick thank you for all the organizers who have invited us Kota Kita. It's a great, I think, opportunity for us from Indonesia to share our learnings with colleagues in India and beyond. Particularly in the case of India, I think we share certain similarities in our planning efforts. As Ian has introduced, my organization is called Kota Kita, which means actually a city for all in our city in Indonesia. And in terms of practices, I think at the core, our mission is really to create an inclusive city, which starts with informed and empowered citizens who are engaged to make meaningful, inclusive, and thoughtful decisions. And in that, a major practice that we've tried to advocate it is really in using democratic and participatory approaches in urban development processes to improve the urban spaces. And our experience in the past 10 years have focused on relatively 4 approaches that we've sort of developed and refined over the past years. And as I listened to my previous colleagues, Raj and Ramola, I found that it's interesting that here in Indonesia, we also face a similar challenges in terms of inclusive and accessibility features being implemented in a piecemeal nature, and having to explain the mindset of charity versus rights, and having faced the problem that maybe not necessarily the budget is there, but the priority is not there. And so in our experience, we've always we try to start with data, and that's how we first start to engage government stakeholders with data. And how we conducted that is through participatory data collection, our initiative. So in that aspect, we focus on conducting data collection in a city scale using participatory approaches so that we gain and compile fine-grained data and insights of persons with disabilities. And we've conducted this in 2 cities in Indonesia. It's called Surakarta, which is our home city, and also Banjarmasin. And the main challenge is really because in Indonesia right now, and perhaps in other cities around the world, there's not enough fine-grained data about people with disabilities. And most of the time, the data it's different between one city and within the data in a national scale. And so this is the first, I think, challenge for us to tackle is what is the actual condition that's happening in that city. So in both Banjarmasin and Surakarta, through our efforts, for example, in Banjarmasin, we then determined that we're almost 4,000 people with disabilities living in Banjarmasin city, which is more than was actually documented by the city government. And that data was able to support the government in double checking the number of eligible voters for an election. In the case of Surakarta, another city in Indonesia, we also documented almost 4,000 people with disabilities living in the city. And that data was able to sort of support the city government in developing a roadmap for an inclusive city. And so that's how, in our experience, data has always been a powerful tool in starting a conversation with the government so that they see the actual situation that's happening in that city. A second approach that we've implemented is in community-centric design or co-design. So once we sort of mapped out and identified the gaps in the city, we focus on a specific community in empowering and informing their capacity to create and influence the spaces in their surroundings. For instance, again, following up on the data from the Participatory Data Collection Initiative, we engaged communities in a city, 2 neighborhoods in Banjarmasin, in building an inclusive community hub. So the residents there, which range from people with disabilities to older people to mothers, they were able to participate in sort of identifying their aspirations of a public space, and also creating features that they want to see in that public space. And so through that process, their capacity to sort of negotiate their needs and advocate for their aspirations became increased. And at the same time, our process, because we value participatory approach, we also try to cultivate sort of raising awareness on inclusive issues in the process of that co-design, so that the inclusive principles are not just known for a specific group, but also known by all members of the neighborhoods. And another approach that we conducted is really through using creative tools and methodologies that ensure the inclusive and meaningful participation of all groups of people, regardless of age, gender, abilities, and disabilities. Or we recognize that in processes, we might have consultative processes, we might have FGDs, but most of the time, these FGDs do not accommodate for the needs and aspirations of the people involved. And I'm sorry, just wanted to check really quick. Are my voice okay, or am I having trouble?
No, it's okay. We can hear you.
Okay, because I think. And so some of the tools that we've used, for example, is through our work with the GDI Hub, for example, we've used tools such as Photo Voice to work with people with disabilities in expressing their aspirations regarding a public space. We've also used journey mapping as a tool to ask people with disabilities in understanding the challenges and the experiences they face in navigating the city. And we found that these approaches are able to create a safe space for vulnerable groups to express their aspirations according to what they're comfortable with, so that they are able to meaningfully engage. And I think the last point that I want to make is really in engaging all other stakeholders to participate, particularly the government. I think reflecting back on what my previous colleagues say about how most of the time the government officials have good intention but lack references, for example, in practices and implementation. I think that's the same case for us in Indonesia as well. Most of the time, we have to admit that government officials remain sort of the final decision makers and the key stakeholders in building an inclusive city. And so a big task is really in ensuring their participation and their understanding as to what practical knowledge are in building an inclusive city. And so that's sort of our efforts have always both engaged the communities, but we also want to ensure that the government officials are also engaged and participating in the process as well. For instance, a lot of our initiatives, we of course have focus group discussions with the city government officials, and we also try to consolidate this insight that we gained from the community to a policy, a specific policy action that is being created by the government. Currently, we are working in a city called Semarang in Indonesia to work with the city government there in ensuring safe and comfortable service of public transportation, so that vulnerable groups can enjoy public transportation in a safe and comfortable manner. And so I think that's an important process as well, to ensure that the government officials are informed and equipped with the knowledge of practical inclusive planning practices. I think those are 4 sort of major reflections from our side. Ian, I think I'll stop there and open up for any questions afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was great, really great. And again, made some notes, as with the other panelists, just that really stood out for me. Just the need to really start with really good data, and that data coming from local people, local persons with disabilities in particular, and how important it is to really engage and get those city government stakeholders really on side and to understand the issues really well and to engage and participate also. Thank you very much. That's great. I think what we're going to do now, we've got a couple of poll questions still to do. So I think I'll pause here again and we'll do our 3rd poll question, I think, if that's all right, if the guys that are managing that can put the third poll question up for us all. This one asks, which articles, this is testing your knowledge now, so which articles of the United Nations CRPD elaborate on accessibility? So is it Article 3? Is it Article 4? Is it Article 9? Is it all of the above, or is it none of the above? There we go, testing your CRPD knowledge in detail. So if you could answer that poll for us, that would be great. While you guys are doing that, just to say that I've taken a note of some questions already, and I see that Ramala, thank you so much for answering one of those questions in particular in the chat. So yeah, if you have any questions to put to our panelists, you can either add them to the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll do our best to pick those up at the end. So our poll on accessibility has completed. I can tell you that 4% thought it was Article 3. No people said Article 4. 48% said Article 9. 43% said all of the above, and 4% said none of the above. Now, I have to confess, I don't actually have the answers in front of me, but I think it's all of the above. I think it's Article 3,
Yes.
4, and yes.
Yes, it's all of the above.
Testing my own knowledge. So well done to 43% of you who got that one correct. Okay, so I shall move on to our fourth and final panelist. I'd like to introduce Ms. Nidhi Goyal, who is the founder and executive director of award-winning non-profit organisation Rising Flame. Nidhi has been working on disability rights and gender justice for the past 12 years and sits on the steering committee of Civil 20 or C20 under India's G20 presidency, and has been instrumental in creating the historic Disability Equality Justice Working Group within the C20. So the question we pose to Nidhi is, how can inclusive urban planning processes be adopted to ensure that the voices of underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities are heard and included? So Nidhi, I pass over to you.
Thank you so much. I think this is the beauty of being the last speaker, that most of the points are already spoken, and then the polls add to the interesting information gaps that were there. But I will circle back by referring to one of our first speakers, thinking about how inclusive planning can be implemented, particularly for those living with disabilities who are vulnerable or have intersectional identities or are living at the margins. I think by beginning with the thought that our first speaker said, that disability is not someone else's issue. If you look at the data, I mean, of course, 1.3 billion persons in the world, but if you look at how it impacts society, it's every sixth person lives with a device issue, and that needs to be at the top framing when we're talking about implementation, when we're talking about making it happen, when we're talking about how can inclusive planning be effective, implemented and adopted. Now thinking about, again, reflecting what would be important is creating awareness, and I will come to data as well, reiterating from the previous speaker, but I think the very, very first step is around creating awareness and building an understanding of what is the socioeconomic cost of not having this sort of inclusion. So a larger figure says 7% of GDP is the cost of exclusion of persons with disabilities, but particularly in urban spaces, to think about the socioeconomic cost and what is it, where do we not see meaningful participation if the spaces are not inclusive. So conducting very focused research and creating awareness out of the outcomes on what is the impact on access to education for persons with disabilities, employment, disaster response, and we heard about climate financing, but it's very important that urban cities are instrumental for disaster response. And the reason I lay out all of this is because multiple departments within governments, multiple ministries need to come and make this commitment because it impacts multiple areas. So when we're talking about education, employment, disaster response, but also very importantly, thinking about women with disabilities or at the intersection of gender and disability, violence redress and response, we often talk about one of the exit opportunities or exit possibilities, not opportunities, for women with disabilities to step out of violent situations is to access shelter homes, which become then an integral part of building safe, inclusive, accessible cities. So what is the safe city looking like when it is at the intersection of gender and disability? One of the campaigns run by us basically said that the way women with disabilities would envision access to a space, or how a space could become inclusive for them, which is urban spaces, is thinking about safety and accessibility together. So when we only talk about accessibility, we are leaving a very important component of the gender bit out within disability. We are looking at all of these when it comes to meaningful participation, because very often we are talking about meaningful participation, but breaking that down becomes very important. I would also say in the primary steps from research and awareness, data collection, again, will be a very important step when we're thinking about implementation or making the inclusion happen within open spaces, but with the planners and policy makers. The data collection, not just in terms of disability, but again, a disaggregated data where we're looking at other markers, where we're looking at women with disabilities, queer persons with disabilities, and what is their location? What are the spaces that they occupy, and how many of them are currently living in cities, and what is the mobility that they're looking at or using? You know, what are the last mile connectivities? What are the modes of transport? So having data disaggregated by disability and other markers or vulnerability of groups is extremely important to think about. Very often it's that accessible technology solutions for people with disabilities, but thinking about, again, the accessible technology solutions being gender and disability sensitive is extremely, again, important, because what happens is when it comes to technology solutions around safety for women with disabilities are left out. So often the WCAG guidelines, the Web Consortium accessibility guidelines are not followed by apps, by systems, by SOS buttons, by exit mechanisms, which are technology driven to make urban spaces safe and accessible for women with disabilities. Thinking about and what would really help is designing and planning with persons with disabilities at the table as technical experts, but also having persons across disabilities, not just locomotor disabilities, person living with blindness or low vision, but really deafblind persons, persons with intellectual disabilities, persons who are AAC users, right? And queer persons with disabilities, having them at the table. So thinking about a mixed group of persons with disabilities, having with the policymakers at the table would be extremely important. Budgetary allocations. We can talk about all of this without a solid commitment. And now, again, to having the twin track approach to disability, but having a twin track approach to budgetary commitments is extremely important, to having a specific disability inclusion budgetary commitment, but within the women ministries, having a budgetary commitment to thinking about urban spaces, women and disability inclusion. Within education, thinking about urban spaces, persons with disabilities and education. So having a twin track approach when it comes to budgetary commitment is also important. And lastly, but most important, we go back to the basics, that when we are talking to urban planners, it's important to not just start talking to them when they become urban planners and policymakers. Having disability inclusion or disability as a subject within the curricula of policymakers. So, you know, master's programs in public policy or the planning, urban planning courses, architectural courses, engineering courses are extremely important as a first step to already visibilize disability, to put the disability issues at the table, and to ensure that a coherent, inclusive response mechanisms, systems, and action plan can be developed to achieve urbanization, urban planning and development, which is sensitive and inclusive to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. That was great. And again, taking some top level notes there. It really chimes with me the need for this subject to be in the curriculum for these future decision makers. I think that I agree completely with you how important that is. And I also thank you for bringing the gender lens to this, thinking about women with disabilities, these twin track approaches, and also just, I think being respectful and understanding the diversity and the rich range of different disabilities, and making sure that those are at the table in these critical decisions that have been made in urban development plans. So thank you very much. Great. I'd just like to pause a moment and just thank all of our panelists for their contributions. We've now got some time to have our Q&A session with the audience. Now, we have had some questions put into the chat, so thank you for those. I'm going to pick some of those up now. And we do have a final poll question, which we're going to leave till the end. We're going to tantalize you with that. We'll leave that as a kind of final sign off, I think, or poll question, I think. But let me come then to some of the questions that have come in from you, the audience. Now, there's been actually some complementary questions which I've tried to kind of group a little bit. There was one question that came in around certification, which I found interesting. It was talking specifically about India, but I think this is actually true of all countries and cities, about the importance of certification of buildings, particularly public buildings, I guess, but this could reflect all building development, and how important that certification could be to good inclusive design by providing an incentive, I think, or incentives for building developers and building operators. Perhaps even if you meet a certain rating or with the certification, there might be incentives like a reduction in building rates or something like that. And also, I like the idea around certification and driving competition. I think that's, for me, an important thing, to drive competition between designers and architects and developers to be good at this. So I think, what I'll do is I'll open it to the panel, and feel free to jump in. If not, I'll have to pick on one of you. But does anyone of our panel members like to pick up the point around the need for certification and what that might unlock? Ramala.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think this is a very important point, and it's good that it has been raised. As you know, we did work to develop some guidelines, building guidelines, and standardization is becoming a really important part of how we address accessibility. It requires also strong reviews from the authorities to ensure that they do understand what plans they are approving. And one example I wanted to take in terms of incentives was that here in Tbilisi, there were two housing developments, residential developments, which were lying unfinished. And one of the incentives that the City Hall provided to a private sector developer, and this was through one of our private sector the operational department, worked with a developer who was willing to apply the inclusive cities guidelines to improve the accessibility standards. They actually undertook an accessibility audit for this unfinished building, and then they made improvements in the design and went ahead with it. Now, the advantage for this, you would wonder why would a private sector developer go to this extent, was because they wanted to be the first. They want to be kind of, pioneering this kind of development. They want to actually, that is kind of seen as a particular high end, though it is affordable housing. But the fact that they could provide something which is value addition actually brings to the fore that this is somewhere where the government can work with the private sector. There is some kind of an incentive. There could be other areas also where the local bodies could, subsidize in some sense, provide additional floor space index, or that could create an incentive for not only affordable housing, but also for inclusion of accessibility elements in the design. So I think it's an important point for all, not only private sector developers, but also the government to start thinking about how do we actually bring in incentives and how do we actually enable this kind of development. I'll stop there.
I would just argue that for anything, right, from my experience having worked in cities, is anything we need to think scalability, right? I would rather have average stuff everywhere in the city then have just a few, like a good park being done and very beautifully done with all kinds of standards. I think most of the time, and my 15 some year, 20-year career of being in policy, NGO and all, we need, I keep emphasizing the thing that even whether this group exists or not, even if this, this seminar exists or not, how does the city go forward? So I don't think Singapore, you need to go advise anybody to do anything because it's part of the standard. You know, you don't get your license, you get punished, etc., etc. You know, whatever works in that system. So I think we need to now ask ourselves, what are the few levers? See, for example, if any ABD or World Bank does projects, they are very serious about inclusive design, etc. So that is not the problem. The problem is on a daily basis when Corporation of Chennai or somebody does something, who's monitoring them, who's enforcing the standard. So there, I guess the legal has to come in, the standards have to come in, etc. So I think as a group, we need to start thinking which are the few 80-20 rule, which are the few levers that we need to push, which will translate into large average action. So be it. I'm not expecting perfection right now. Average action, scalable in all these areas. So simple example, buses, right? I would argue that we were at least in India, I found that everything is penny wise, pound foolish. We argue about the AC bus for rich people and the third-rate bus for the poor person, and one bus which is wheelchair accessible for the among 100 for the wheelchair and so on. When cities could easily afford every bus to be an AC bus that kneels. So I don't have to be waiting for 100th bus to pick me up and take me somewhere if I'm in a wheelchair. Every bus could be inclusive, and it's not going to cost us anything. With the amount of flyovers we do and amount of highways we do. So I think we need to. And what I'm frustrated about is we as people, all of us who care about this subject, we need to do some homework in terms of finance, in terms of standards, etc., and say, at least few states, can you start enforcing these things? A smart city mission, can you adopt this and just say, look, you want smart city money, you better do this, right? I think we need to think scalability.
Scalable, I like that. I like that. Yeah, Vanessa, yeah.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add our experiences in, working with city government officials in Indonesia. So for us, in terms of standards, there are some regulatory framework already exist in sort of highlighting or detailing, for example, guiding blocks or ramps and such. So the standards in a way exist, but we face the same problem in implementation and sort of monitoring the actual building of it. I think there are two big barriers that we've sort of faced. The first is really in the lack of involvement or assessment by, for example, organizations of people with disabilities in actually being able to participate in the monitoring process, because in most cases it's perhaps they're not involved within the construction process. And the second part is really in ensuring I think it touches upon what Romola said in having the knowledge of universal design not being kept in just sort of inclusive urban planners, but all urban planners. Because in our case in Indonesia, sometimes, for example, for one of our project, the city government might be informed about universal design practices. The community might be informed, but so for example, in the construction of one of our co-design initiative, we work with contractors, and these are contractors who aren't always familiar with why we need a ramp to be in certain height and such. And so I think the second barrier that we need to tackle, of course, other than implementing standards, and it is ensuring that all stakeholders involved in city building are informed and treat sort of universal design practices as a standard. I think that's one of, I agree that's sort of a scalable way for us to really target knowledge in these pockets of stakeholders in order to move forward so that, we can start implementing it in practice. So that's sort of my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks very much. Okay, I think what I'll do, I've got a couple of other quick takeaway kind of questions from the chat. They're kind of connected though, but I like what we've been talking about there about Raj in particular talking about the need for this to be kind of mandated, which for me is the stick. I think we need, and I do also agree that we need that, as well as the carrot, which I think is, it comes back a little bit to the need for education and training to have our designers, decision makers, really want to do this and know how to do it well and understand why it's important. I guess that comes back a little bit to education. And there was a question in the chat about that, it was around the centres for excellence, but it was also about how we educate this subject, disseminate that education. It was combined with the kind of role of perhaps allowing maybe OPDs to take on an auditor role or something. I guess I'd put a question to the panel around that, around education curriculum. Is there any examples that you have that you're aware of from your local areas or regions that you've worked where there is good examples of good inclusive design in the curriculum, in academia for architects, urban planners, designers? How prevalent is that, and how important is that to tackle this issue? I'd put that to the panel, if anyone would like to jump in. Perhaps someone we've not heard from. So Nidhi, would you like to come in on that?
So I was just smiling because we do have institutions who have implemented this, and we do see planners who become aware. So I'm not very sure how to elaborate that, but it's just when you're educating the people who are going to be constructing in the future, they also see this as an opportunity, right? As the first piece to be unique, to set a standard which others would replicate, so be the first in the area. It's really sad that we're still in a state that planners, urban planners, architects, etc., when they build something accessible, it's very often the first in the local area, the city, the space, etc. But it brings a lot of excitement. So it brings the understanding, of course, it builds the capacity of the individual, the classroom, the professional, but it also opens up opportunities for them within the careers, and it's seen as opportunities to build a unique space. It's also understood as, particularly in the global south, that you are moving towards building or emulating what a developed country would do. So I think there are many opportunities that come with, and we have seen urban planners, etc. But again, it goes back to something that was said, that we then become, if budget becomes a constraint, if advocacy and that influence in the policy space becomes an issue, we are looking at these very quick fixes of, let's take one bus, which is accessible. Let's have this main road, which is accessible. And where does one turn after that? So I think it really is an interconnected, and it needs change and commitment at every level. While curriculum, including this in curriculum, is important, I would again reiterate that it's an interconnected, positively a web, and it needs a multi-stakeholder approach, going back to what Mr. Sharp, Shambi was mentioning, that we need really a commitment from the public, private, all of the partnerships. So government, civil society, industry, everybody coming together for this commitment, because finally it needs to see the carrot approach, as you were saying, Ian, that we will create spaces for all, for elderly, for pregnant women, for children, for people who temporarily meet with accidents, etc.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you. Yeah, I like looking at it as in a positive way, to look at this as perhaps a career opportunity, to be able to lead that. We spoke about, someone mentioned during the panel session, the need to have champions in this area and how important that is. And I think that by having this across the curriculum, you will inevitably create a whole host of champions. Certainly that's what we aim with in a relatively small way through our master's course that we teach at UCL, University College London. We see our alumni, our graduates, as champions going out into the various different industries and roles they'll take on with this really good grounding in disability inclusion and inclusive design. And that's really important, I think, for the future of the industry. Anyone else want to come in on that before I move on? I think I might have time just for one final quick question. There was a point made around around standards. And I guess I know, Ramola, you've already touched on the standards produced for Georgia, which I know are available online on the ADB website. But someone did comment about, you know, the need for good technical standards, but then the need for those to really reflect low resource settings and the different contexts in different countries. Again, I just wanted to maybe ask the panel if anyone has any kind of good examples that they are aware of, can share, or just to comment on the need for kind of, you know, the localization for standards to really respond to the local context. Any comments from the panel on that one?
I think there are a lot of standards out there. So 20 years ago, I remember lack of internet. It was very difficult to find something. Today, thanks to YouTube, etc., plus actual standards. So if you want to get to like a really, really micro level, like what Singapore does, all the way to ITTP and others have done pretty good work on Indian standard, for example. But my general advice would be any standard works. Because we cannot spend I mean, you take something, start somewhere. That's at least I'm talking from Indian context, okay? Because if you now there is enough standard which will apply in an Indian context. Now the focus has to be, like I said earlier, and I'm sorry I'm repeating, to make them actually at least use that standard, right? Because the moment you can do localization, for example, is you start asking yourself. For example, the trees planted along the footpath, as an example, right? There are standards available out there. Now the question is, who's going to put that standard and this standard together? What about the ducting under the footpath? Do you want a ducting or not a ducting? Because that raises the cost of infrastructure. So I think we need to start somewhere, and most cities have not even thought about this. So I would suggest that take an ITDB standard, take some of the Indian standard, just say, yes, let's start with something. But there is another interesting point, I think, that comes up in this seminar. There is capacity problem on this side also. So, for example, if tomorrow government were to come and say, hey, please help me, audit all the buildings of Chennai, all the footpaths of Chennai, I can guarantee you we can't find more than 2 people to come and help you. There's a severe capacity problem on this side. And then the bureaucrat gets frustrated because he's done trying to do something nice. There's no response from the other side. So we need to probably think of alternate technologies and other mechanisms that doesn't rely on the age-old way of stakeholder involvement, etc. I don't have the answer for it. One quick answer would be, for example, when we created a plaza, we wanted to make sure that visually impaired can go, like in a mall, say that, hey, this is this store, this is a historical building. But then trying to get something that implemented is unbelievably difficult because you don't have enough people to create those signs and so on. So now that we have smartphones, etc., are there other technologies which can leapfrog and not simply rely on traditional way of doing things? So again, scalability. I'm just sorry to bore you with the word scalability. Unless we scale, we can't handle this kind of millions and billions of people.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that response. And I am very conscious of our time now. So we're reaching the end of this side event session. I think we'll put our final poll question up. I did tease you with that. So let's get that final poll question up for everyone. So all of our audience members, thank you so much for your questions. If you could all respond to this final question, which is about inclusive design, it simply asks, do you think inclusive design principles should be at the heart of all urban policy, planning and design frameworks in cities? And obviously we have strongly agree, can't say disagree, or strongly disagree. And as I would expect to see, the vast majority strongly agreeing with us there. 96% of you, in fact, and 4% agreeing. So I think we're all preaching to the converted here. I think we all agree this needs to happen. I'll pass over now to UN Habitat colleagues to do the formal close of the side event. But I'd just like to thank the panelists from my behalf. Some really fantastic key points coming out there. I think I've run out of time to do a kind of summary of those. But yeah, do join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions today. And I'll hand back to I think our colleagues at UN Habitat to do India to do closing remarks. Thanks.
Yeah. So much, Ian, and I'm really grateful for all the panelists for joining and for your inputs. I think really interactive Q&A that we also had. We have so many questions in the chat box as well as in the Q&A tab. So we hope to keep the conversation going. Please reach out to us even beyond this session. And I'm sure everyone will be happy to answer your questions. And we don't have to limit ourselves to the event here. Moving to the next part of the session, I now invite Ms. Parul Agarwal, who is the Country Program Manager of UN Habitat India. She has extensive experience in implementing urban initiatives for sustainable spatial planning and local economic growth, and while applying urban design concepts for visible urban transformations. Prior to India, she managed the Clean and Green Cities program at UN Habitat in Afghanistan, which has developed to improve lives of the urban poor with a special focus on women. So with this, I really invite Ms. Parul for delivering the closing remarks.
Thank you, Adishri, and it was a delight to sit in and listen to such an engaging discussion. From what I gather, we have a very, in a very articulately and very comprehensively covered what could be the potential drivers of change. Our panelists have covered areas around standards and regulations, and we have also through our discussion learned that specifically in the context of India, there is no dearth of these. The right of persons with disabilities covers several aspects and which are reflected in the national campaigns, the Accessible India campaign, and how various urban missions are attempting to incorporate the intent and the mandate under this act. We have also looked at the standards and the guidelines, and Raj, you are correct that there is just plenty of data, plenty of guidelines around from the macro down to the level of what should be the slope of a ramp. And that is available for cities in India, responding to the context. We have also spoken about the panelists on how to engage communities, how to engage the local youth practitioners to spread the word, to have them participate around this important discussion. This important area. I really truly thank everyone here for your insightful comments, to all the panelists, and to Ian for being such an excellent moderator. And we will certainly continue to continue this dialogue on several other forums, and hope to also share the learnings. I would also like to thank our resident coordinator, Mr. Shombi Shark, for setting the stage so accurately and representing how important leaving no one behind and inclusive policy planning and design is a cross-cutting theme. And the efforts that UN agencies are making in their programmatic responsibilities, and right from the planning, designing to implementation, to ensure that we stay true to our mandate, and in doing so we take all our partners along with us in this journey. So thank you once again for your time.
And heartily thank our interpreters, Saurav and Arun, for providing us with their guidance and cooperation in making sure everyone can see, hear, know about the event. Yeah. So yeah, thank you all for joining, and we will see you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.